Hi, thanks for the opportunity to be here today and to talk a little bit about my experiences and how I have been affected by cultic organizations and the coercive control and psychological abuse they use. My name's Joy Cranham. I was born and raised in the Plymouth Exclusive Brethren, which is a fundamentalist Christian group. I struggled there because it was on the tip of my tongue to say evangelical, but they're not evangelical. They are very closed and actually don't often do conversions or wish to recruit individuals. Their way of maintaining their population is purely through gendered extreme roles where women are breeders. And so within that incredibly closed environment that, I've already alluded to, have these very rigid gendered roles, there's often difficulty in finding ways to express yourself. But the rules were certainly a lot more controlling than that within the Brethren, and I think it's fairly well documented. The rules were based around not engaging with the outside world. So though this organization is very much a part of the world, very much a capitalist business model organization, they aren't meant to vote, even though they will. There's evidence now that they influence elections if they can, certainly through promoting ideologies that support them. But people aren't meant to vote, which in Australia, where I grew up, was interesting because in fact voting is a compulsory requirement of every citizen. And so they used to have to write letters each time there was a vote and be conscientious objectors to this democratic process. The other rules that they adhered to were, that enabled them to express this notion of separation was not to engage with novels, reading any literature that was not deemed factual. So encyclopedias were allowed, but even then there was a censorship around Darwin and evolution and topics that were deemed unchristian. Television and radio were not permitted. We had to attend church 10 times a week every day and 4 times on Sunday. So it was incredibly consuming and all-consuming. For myself, though, I feel quite fortunate in the fact that in the 1970s and 80s, which is when I was going to school, the school system was that children were educated in mainstream state-funded schools. Since the change of leadership from Simonton to Hales, that got tightened up because Hales really started wanting, well, he's a lot more of a businessman. And so they started their own schools globally. And for me, when I reflect on children going to school inside the Brethren, and they are Brethren only schooling system, it's chilling, because the amount of oppression, the amount of bullying, the hierarchical structures inside the Brethren meant that certain families had more status than others. And that would just be duplicated and reaffirmed in this educational environment. The other reason why I find it so chilling is that school was such a brilliant space for me. I thoroughly enjoyed school. I enjoyed the freedom I could experience there. I enjoyed the fact I could realize things about myself. I like learning. I still like learning. But finding things out was so liberating, and it just felt like a space where I could be. I enjoyed reading, which, as I've already said, was a punishable, was deemed a rule-breaking activity. And I guess those two spaces, where going to school and being free or being more free, having access to literature. I mean, I'm not talking revolutionary literature here. I'm not even talking Tolkien or Tolstoy. I'm talking kind of, Little Women, Little House on the Prairie, these kind of very simplistic narratives about people living good lives and how yet they had more freedom than I had. They had more capacity to do things, to make mistakes than I did. Because of the rules, there was such a need to adhere to these very tight, rigid, restrictive agendas. If not, according to the doctrine, breaking those rules meant eternal damnation. And, for my young mind, that was terrifying. The notion of being burnt alive, but never consumed by fire for all eternity. It's deeply, deeply terrifying. And now as an adult and as an advocate for children's rights and an advocate for practices to keep children safe, I find it abhorrent that that idea is permissible in our society. Certainly in my career that I developed when leaving the Brethren, I went on and I became a teacher and I became a management with inside a school. If I had heard a parent walking their child out the gate say something like, "You've misbehaved today and I'm going to go home and put your hand in fire," I would have stopped that parent from taking their child home. And yet, in so many other instances, and right now throughout the world, so many children are getting told that very message. And it's not just for a short period of time. It's not even, that story of that child that rightly should be protected from such a parent. There's something about the notion of hell that even death doesn't stop, which makes it such an assault. That if someone can be assaulted and then death will stop the assault, that's a horrible way to go, but it can be stopped at that point. It can't be stopped if, in fact, after death, the punishment will be initiated. And that's horrible. So for me, I have this very vivid, very provocative image and understanding of hell as it was taught in the doctrine. I didn't make this up. This is how the doctrine was portrayed. I also had this very clear understanding of what I had to do or what I had to become in order to avoid that space. And that was torturous because, in fact, I could never be that becoming. I could never be that person that would avoid that destiny. So in my expressions of freedom or expressions of myself at school, when I was reading, that was fine and it was okay until the evening came and it was time for me to go to sleep. And I couldn't. Within moments, I would be thinking about my day or reflecting on my day or thinking about the characters I might have even been reading about in the story. But very quickly, my thoughts would then drift to what that meant against the doctrine, which meant I'd end up having night terrors and wouldn't be able to sleep for fear of my destiny. That became so torturous that by the time I was 14, I literally wasn't sleeping. I was feeling like I was going mad. Admittedly, at 14, I had access to more a range of novels at the secondary school library I was going to. But it just became unbearable. And it got to the point where I went to the local school council, the school councillor, and said, I'm being raised in this organization and I would very much like to find out if there are ways that I can move away from it. And this is part of what I advocate now about we need to train professionals in a different way. Because his very poor advice to me was go home and talk to my parents about it, which foolishly I did. And that was horrible. That was a really horrible, horrible experience. And it didn't resolve anything. I didn't get any closer to realizing a sense of freedom. I didn't get any closer to realizing a sense of myself being good enough to not have that destiny. And so for the next 3 years, I fluctuated between that space of doubling down on myself to become as good as I could be, or fantasizing with the notion of freedom. And then I'd have to double down on myself again, because in fact, that fantasy of freedom, the omnipresent God would have been offended by it. And that degree of cognitive dissonance is so torturous. And the underlying message in that dissonance is something about yourself or my self-image. My image was in both those positions. I was not good enough. I was bad. I was worthy of this incredible punishment once I was dead. And that was, yeah, those 3 years of my life, from the time I was 14 to about 17, were absolutely torturous. And interestingly, no one knew I was being tortured, because there was no one I could speak to. The counselor had certainly shown me that very clearly. And I think that's one of the profound, now as an adult, you know, doing the work I'm doing, I am really curious about the fact that survivors of coercive control, the injuries and the trauma that is associated with those deep adverse experiences are invisible. They can't be seen. And that's part of the insidiousness of them. It is invisible. And for coercive control as well, as an act, it's not physical. It's seldom physical. It doesn't need to be. No one was telling me once I understood I was going to hell that I was going to hell. I heard that kind of once or twice maybe, and then that was my understanding of it. But at the age of 17, I had left school by that stage, and I was working for a local, a Plymouth Brethren brother in my locality, who owned a printing office. And I made a mistake on a business card. And in me apologizing and noticing this, he behaved inappropriately, not massively, but it was inappropriate, and it was an intrusive, unwelcome touch. And I said, I'm resigning, I'm out of here. You know, I was so stressed, I hadn't been sleeping well for such a long time, all the rest. It was like there was something in that violation of that act that was a tiny window of opportunity, and I took it. I had no other resources, but just that little tiny opportunity. So I said, I'm resigning. You know, I'll do the honourable thing. I'll work for you for another fortnight, then I'm out of here. He never believed me. What was extraordinary is this man never told my parents this. He never told anybody. He hoped it would just go away. Interestingly, a woman came into the print office on the Friday night of the end of my resignation notice. And I just told her my story. There was something about her that I don't know. I had to kind of put it out there. And she said, you've got my business card, Stuart. If ever you make that choice, please give me a call. Unknown to her, if she was just being wildly generous or not, I did make that call following Monday morning. And so with 3 layers of clothes and $120, I left. And without the kindness of that woman, I don't know. But one of the real ironies about that woman is the business cards that I was printing was for World Christianity. What's it called? Unification of World Christianity Priority Limited, which in short terms is the Moonies. And interestingly, that little commune of Moonies, who I've since spoken to, former Moonie members, you know, very established, well-known anti-culty activists like Steve Hassan. And, you know, I've told him this story, and he's like, oh, this should not happen according to the rules. But I think there's something in this little story of this little commune of young Moonies, they were all young, who took this young woman in who was incredibly vulnerable and gave her the space of 3 weeks to get her life together, of which I did. I got a job and I found an alternative place to live and all of that. And I don't advocate that people go looking for the Moonies, but what I am saying, I think this story highlights just how incredibly vulnerable I was. And weirdly, just that weird irony of the Moonies looking after me. And they did, they really did. They, at that time in the late 80s, the Moonies themselves were very much caught up in all sorts of trouble in the States around kidnapping and processes of exiting cultic stuff. There was all sorts of stuff going on. But at one stage, my parents found out where I was, and my mother and sister came to the space, you know, to the commune, to the address, which is just in the suburbs of the town I grew up in. And my mother very much wanted me to go back to my sister's house. My sister was married and had children, or had one child at that time. And I was like, no, I can't. And the only thing I could say was, no, I can't. I didn't want to engage with them. It was too dangerous. It felt, my situation was too precarious. And the Moonies intervened and said, take Joy back to your house. We will follow in our car. We will wait outside. You have 60 minutes. The 61st minute, if Joy doesn't reappear, we're calling the police and saying that someone's being held against their will. Which, you know, it's an irony, because that is exactly what the Moonies were being accused of themselves. But I guess it highlights the fact that cultic manipulations and coercion happen to good people. They don't happen to bad people or to strange people or anything. They happen to very normal people who have actually often got good intent. That is often the, you know, the people that you will find in these organizations. Of course there are bad people in them. Of course there are people who are in there enjoying the power and the exploitation they can manipulate others with. But primarily people, good people, get recruited into these organizations. And I don't advocate that people join the Moonies. What I advocate for is that our social services become a lot more aware of the needs of young people and of old people, of people who may be leaving coercive control situations. Not just cults, though cults are an example that seems to get marginalized. People feel quite uncomfortable, in my perception, of talking about cultic organizations and cultic recovery. But I think our public services, social services, job centres, housing associations, doctors, spaces of medical assistance, the police, all need to become a lot more informed about coercive control and the damaging effects of it, and be more responsive and curious about people who may be appearing in front of them with absolutely nothing and with extraordinary stories to tell. And that takes quite a lot of work, I think. I think it takes a training trainers to be ensuring that young social workers have this awareness, that people that are working, being employed in these public facing services are able to identify and understand what it means if someone says to them, I've left a coercively controlling group. And even if the person doesn't have that vocabulary of a coercively controlling group, they're able to understand. If someone says, I've just left a drug gang, I've just escaped a violent marriage, I've just escaped a organization in which I wasn't allowed to do whatever, that they will start to add that up, that those kind of oppressions are manipulated through coercive control. And that's where I really want to, as an activist, put my energies. It's also where I want to put my energies as a researcher, as an academic researcher, which is what I am now. How can we enable society to be more resilient and resistant of these organizations, which involves training at a preventative level about how these organizations recruit, and that's cults as well as other coercively controlling groups. It means taking the coercive controlling laws now that are applied to domestic relationships and expanding them to include organizations and groups. And it involves people being prepared to hear those uncomfortable, challenging situations that coercive control is a manipulation that often doesn't have physical abuse attached to it, that it is incredibly scarring. And the other uncomfortable truth that in fact we are all potentially vulnerable to these situations. And we're all potentially vulnerable to these situations because we are human. And it's our humanity that is played on. Our desire, Cialdini goes through all the different persuasions, doesn't he? The authority, the liking to be liked, the reciprocity, consensus, consistency. They are all aspects of us just being human and being able to be persuaded. But if we're being persuaded nefariously, it can lead to very unhealthy relationships. And that's where Stein's work then comes into it around, the attachment and the development of disorganized attachment on the back of those persuasive mechanisms. And so I've rambled on at you now quite a bit, but for me, from my experience of growing up being coercively controlled and absolutely terrified for my eternal life, I am incredibly grateful that I went to a school. I am very slightly aware that the school wasn't able to fully meet my needs when I went and sought help there. And I think that can be improved by training. I'm aware that there was no services I could contact in my desire to leave, and my awareness that I needed support, that I actually grasped at something that could have been very dangerous. And I guess I want these awarenesses to be of benefit in understanding, not another story of someone who has survived a cult. I admire people who have the capacity and the patience to write those biographies and those memoirs. And I encourage people to do that if it is meaningful for them. And at the same time, to find ways to be creative to induce a change in policy and a change in societal awareness. Because in fact, often those stories are captured by people who find them intensely interesting, almost on a voyeuristic level, as opposed to wanting to bring about change. And I think there's something unhelpful in that voyeurism. I would also like the policymakers who endeavour to support and keep young people safe to think really clearly and thoughtfully about a child who is being threatened by a metaphysical presence who will be eternally abusive. I think there is something inherently repulsive and dangerous in that. The loss is huge and it's almost immeasurable. Only recently I've heard the word ambivalent grief. And for me, it's, that definition of losing someone who hasn't actually died. And ambivalent grief is often applied to dementia sufferers or people caring for people with dementia. That form of grief. And I think that sits inside a cultic rupture where a family is broken apart, not because of internal conflicts, but because of an imposed position. Within the Brethren, the losses were huge, and they were huge for a long time in my experience. For myself, I spoke a little bit earlier on about the hierarchical structure and the kudos that structured families within inside those stratospheres. And my family wasn't like that. I also spoke earlier about the fact that Brethren don't do conversions. Ironically, both of my parents were conversions. And what that meant is a hierarchical structure that is built on so much social and heritage culture and capital. So not culture, capital, that notion of, I don't know how familiar people might be with the Old Testament, but there are places in the Old Testament where you just get, so-and-so was begat by so-and-so who was begat by so-and-so, and you just get this genealogy unfolding in front of you. And the Brethren loved begatness. It gave them a structure. The more that you could say, the more begats you had in your hierarchical structure, it often meant, that you were a multiple generational family, and that entitled you to a lot more. I was begat by Pat. That was it. There was no lineage of hierarchy or of kudos inside our family. So against the hierarchy, we were this little bubble waiting for someone to inadvertently kick us in closer to the bottom of the pile even. It felt like we were very much isolated from them. And that had all sorts of ramifications. I'm one of 6 children, so I have 5 siblings. And that was tough and interesting in different ways, and I don't know how to structure the next bit of this, because there's 2 stories to be told in here. One is the fact that my 6 children is a huge family, and if you're not particularly wealthy, then it's a huge expense. It's difficult to maintain, especially when you're in a society or a closed society that assumes certain levels of wealth are needed to be successful. And we did not have access to that. So not only were we short on a social capital, we were also short on a financial capital. And primarily, a lot of that financial stress was brought about not just because we were a large family, but because my father suffered from severe mental illness and was catatonically depressed. He wasn't bipolarly depressed, he was catatonically depressed. He would become so depressed he couldn't move, couldn't speak, was just so very, very depressed. And I mean, I have since acquired a degree in psychology, but I'm no psychiatrist, or I can't do diagnoses of such. But for me, I now fantasize about my father going or being assessed by a psychiatrist, and how do they interpret his profound belief in divinity and in his relationship with divinity, and how was that measured against his extreme depression. And I wonder about whether his depression was fully understood, because for a while he was diagnosed as being schizophrenic, being a paranoid schizophrenic, and maybe he was. Maybe, as I say, I don't understand the diagnosis as well enough, but I can understand that my father responding to some kind of stimuli, and then his first utterances being something about his friend Jesus, and how that might be interpreted would be an effect. But my father did consequently spend long periods of time in mental institutions, the longest up to 18 months. The 2 occasions that I remember were periods of 6 months. And so my family at times was very fractured. We had my mother having to manage that huge difficulty of somehow keeping 6 young children safe, fed, nurtured. The nurturing didn't come into it very much, doesn't often in Poland. And at the same time maintain the status quo that was required to be a good Reverend person. Within that as well, though, what also caused fractures within inside our family was that the brethren when people break rules of a certain age, they are then placed into what's called a shut-up position. It's a position before you actually get kicked out. And what the shut-up position means is the individual who is in that, who has been shut up, is not able to go to church. If perchance a 14-year-old behaves badly, does something bad, smokes, swears at someone, they will be shut up. And as a consequence, the remaining members of the family, because a 14-year-old clearly can't be kicked out of their parents' home. So the remaining children have to leave and go and live with other brethren households. Several times in my childhood, we were fostered out into other brethren's homes for, once again, extended periods of time. The longest was well over a school academic year. It was, went from summer holidays to summer holidays, or over the summer holidays. So it was good 18 months. But there were other times when this also was visited on. These long extended periods of time of illegal fostering, and it is illegal fostering, is still carrying on today in the Burma. And it is illegal, and people need to start paying attention to it. It's illegal in every country that the brethren operate in different guises. In the UK, it is illegal because children who are looked after by non-familial, away from their parents for over 28 days, the local authorities need to be informed. The local authorities are not informed of this. And so basically, it's illegal. It falls into a sense of trafficking. It's the absolute disregard of state law and of child development. And it's incredibly terrifying for a child growing up with a indoctrinated illusion about hell and an indoctrinated view of Armageddon and the rapture, to be separated from your loved ones is such an abuse, because the world could end at any time and you will never see your parents again. That's awful. And to do that to a 7-year-old kid, you know, we've just got to do better with understanding how these organizations work and operate, because this kind of abuse is deeply, deeply scarring. And yes, like all trauma, people can recover to a degree. But like all trauma, injuries require ongoing interventions. And sometimes at different points in life, more significant intervention than one. And I mean, that's physical trauma or psychological trauma. Trauma is deeply scarring. And we have to be aware of how coercive control enables deep psychological trauma to occur. For me, growing up and being separated, I feel slightly more fortunate than my younger brother. I was the second youngest in our family. I had a younger brother. He was often left alone because it would be my immediate brothers who would often get into trouble. And so my younger brother would often be fostered alone in strange families with kids that he mightn't have known, or he would have known them, but you know, we were the bottom of the pile. We weren't a family that people wanted to house. We weren't a family that was felt welcomed. And so I always feel a little bit for my younger brother where that's concerned. But I feel kind of blessed because, well, an irony of that word, I feel fortunate that I was housed with my sister. And I loved my sister. My sister was my safe and secure person. She was only 4 years older than me, but I didn't have many friends. I couldn't understand them. I couldn't understand the brethren children. I was comfortable at school playing soccer and being involved in team sports because I didn't have to have a friend then. I just had to be good at playing soccer. And if I could do that, then I could feel the companionship of others. But when it came to having companionship with brethren children, I often struggled. And so I'd hang with Elizabeth and her friends. And she tolerated me. I must have been such an irritant. And I think when she is for everything I am today. And most of what I am today, I could not have been if I hadn't stayed. I had to leave. I had to leave for my mental health. I had to leave for my life. If I had stayed, I wouldn't have lived. But I think all of my achievements would have been so much brighter if I had my sister with me. All of the difficulties that I have faced would have been a little lighter if I had her. And yet we are separated by the doctrine that believes in separation. And that's profoundly wrong. So for me, loss on leaving that's one of the biggest costs, because I don't have them. And yet that is a cost. I am at ease paying because I cannot. It's impossible. I can't. To go back there to have her in my life is a ridiculous idea. Since that incident at my sister's house, which was incredibly horrible, I have to say that was that the 60 minutes that I alluded to earlier when I went back to Liz's house. I sat in her front room. Her husband was there. Her 2-year-old son was there. And my mother and father were there. And I did not speak. I could not speak. I knew that if I uttered just a sigh, they would have grabbed it. They would have used it. It would have been a wedge that they could have expanded. And I would not have gotten out. The only thing I could do was sit there and wait for that hour to pass. And I could not speak. At the my brother-in-law was preaching at me and telling me that I was bad and that the irony of Jesus loving me, but I'd also be punished forever. The abusive messages that don't actually make sense. My father was crying. My mother was making a lot of noise. She wasn't crying. And I just had to sit there. It was incredibly difficult. It was also comforting to know that there was someone waiting for me outside. To have done that alone would have been almost impossible. So that was so on leaving. That's the one time that my mother has spoken to me. The second time my mother spoke to me was to tell me that my father died, had passed, and that was incredibly tough. That was a good 20 years ago. I've been about 10 years have passed since that time. And they're the only 2 times I've spoken to my mother since I've left. At the change of the leadership, as I alluded to before, I was working in the Middle East, and I got a peculiar phone email from my brother saying that he had to speak to me, and in the email it became clear that it actually wasn't a desire on his part to reconnect to me. It had been a directive that had been sent down by the leadership that everyone who had left had to be recontacted for whatever reason. And anyway, I just kind of went, thank you for letting me know that you had to contact me. I'm glad that you followed the directive, but if you wish to talk to me and reconnect with me, then it has to be because that's your desire, not because you've been told to. And pretty much left it like that. My brother has since got in touch with me to tell me that my mother is now, who is very old, she's now in her 80s, in her late 80s, is now in a nursing home. I know which nursing home it is, but I choose not to contact her. And that's not an easy thing to say, but I think maybe I'm not brave enough. but I see no ease in contacting her. I think she's an 80-year-old woman. She has sacrificed so much to be who she is. She's not going to revert. And I don't know if I would want her to, because what immense sacrifice, what does that mean? So for a very short time, if I was to contact her and say, hi, Mum, it's Joy, I'm okay, my kid's great, yeah, blah, 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 she might be really happy for a little minute. And then the cognitive dissonance would kick in. Then her guilt would kick in. Then her awareness of her loss, of her sacrifices, of her choices, be they liberating or painful, they're what would kick in. And the same for me. I will feel whatever I feel in speaking with her, but nothing will change. And in some respects, that's equally, it's like opening up a wound for no other reason than to open up a wound. And I think I've chosen to keep that wound as it is. It doesn't need agitating. Some people understand that, some people don't. But I think that that's kind of the ambivalent grief thing as well. Or if not, it's on those lines, in that sphere, similar sphere to that. How people deal with this is how people deal with it. This is how I'm choosing to deal with it. I don't think there's a right or wrong way. And it might be that I just don't want that pain. Because there is no reconciliation. There would just be a moment of rule breaking. Well, I break those rules every day of my life, and I'm very pleased to continue doing so.